15 million euros. That is the scale of fine a crypto exchange can face under MiCA when its compliance function exists on paper but not in practice. This is the internal controls episode, the one where we look at how MiCA's Article 62 requirements, ESMA's RTS on governance, and the 3 lines of defense model come together to create a compliance architecture that regulators can actually inspect and approve. Here is the pattern. Regulators are finding over and over again in early MiCA inspections. Firms have compliance policies, they have compliance officers, they have 3 lines of defense org charts, but the compliance function has no real independence, no real budget, and no real authority to challenge the business. That is what gets firms fined. Under MiCA, governance and internal control failures are not just deficiencies in an on-site inspection report. They are grounds for license withdrawal, and individual senior managers, including the CEO and the compliance officer, can be personally fined and barred from the industry. This is not theoretical. NCAs are using these powers. Article 62 of MiCA is the governance article for CASPs. It requires that the management body has responsibility for the CASP's risk strategy and compliance. Individual members are fit and proper. Governance arrangements are proportionate to the nature, scale, and complexity of the CASP, and there are adequate policies to manage conflicts of interest. Article 62 is not a suggestion. Every NCA and every authorization review starts here. The 3 lines of defense model is the framework MiCA implicitly requires for internal controls. The first line is the business, the trading desk, customer operations, the product team, who own and manage risk day to day. The second line is compliance and risk management, independent functions that set standards, monitor the first line, and challenge where needed. The third line is internal audit, which independently tests whether the first and second lines are actually working. The model only works if the second and third lines are genuinely independent from the first. A question for compliance professionals watching this. In your current CASP or crypto firm, does the second line, the compliance function, have genuine budget authority and the ability to block or delay product launches for AML reasons, or is compliance ultimately overruled by commercial pressure? Drop your honest answer in the comments. This is the most important indicator of whether a compliance function is real. Independence for the compliance function means 3 things under MiCA. First, structural independence. The compliance officer does not report to any commercial line manager. They report to the board or a board-level committee directly. Second, resource independence. The compliance function has its own budget that commercial management cannot cut without board sign-off. Third, operational independence. Compliance can access any information, any system, any data it needs without asking commercial permission. All 3 must exist simultaneously. Let me take you through a case that illustrates what a broken compliance function looks like in practice. A mid-size CASP, call it TokenBridge, has a compliance officer who joined from a retail bank's KYC team. Their AML policies are professionally written, their alerts are logged, but the compliance officer has no access to the firm's internal trading data. They rely on reports prepared by the operations team. They have raised concerns about high-volume customers multiple times, but those concerns never make it to the board. And when they wanted to onboard a blockchain analytics tool, the CFO denied the budget. When the NCA inspects TokenBridge, they ask to see 18 months of compliance committee minutes. The minutes show that compliance concerns were raised at the committee level, but none were escalated to the management body. The NCA asks the compliance officer directly, "When you raised the concern about the high-volume customer, what response did you receive from the board?" The answer: "I did not raise it with the board directly. It went to the head of operations." That answer, that structural gap, is a critical governance finding. MiCA Title V contains detailed conflicts of interest rules. A CASP must identify, manage, and disclose conflicts. Common conflicts at CASPs include the CASP trading on its own account in markets where it provides services to customers, senior management holding significant positions in tokens listed on the firm's platform, the compliance officer also performing commercial functions, and proprietary token investments by board members. MiCA requires policies and procedures to manage each of these and requires disclosure to customers where the conflict cannot be eliminated. Every CASP under MiCA needs a documented risk appetite statement. This is a board-level document, not a compliance document, that defines what level of risk the firm is willing to accept in 5 key areas: AML and financial crime risk, market integrity risk, operational risk, custody and technology risk, and conduct and customer protection risk. The risk appetite statement is the board's formal acknowledgement that they own the risk. Without it, the NCA has no baseline to assess whether the firm's actual risk profile is within its stated tolerance. MiCA requires risk-based monitoring, not blanket monitoring of everything at the same level. The EBA's guidelines for CASPs specify that a CASP must calibrate its transaction monitoring to the risk profile of each customer segment. High-risk customers, those with complex ownership structures, high transaction volumes, geographic risk factors, or self-hosted wallet usage, require higher frequency, lower threshold monitoring. Standard retail customers with predictable patterns require less intensive review. A monitoring system that applies the same rules to everyone is not risk-based, it is noise generation. Sanction screening is a specific internal control requirement that is easy to underestimate in the crypto context. A CASP must screen customer names against OFAC, EU, and UN sanctions lists, wallet addresses against blockchain analytics blacklists of sanctioned addresses, and counterparty CASPs in travel rule transfers against sanctions databases. The Tornado Cash OFAC designation cases demonstrated that even interacting with a sanctioned smart contract address without realizing it can generate regulatory exposure. Screening must be real-time and cover the on-chain layer, not just the customer name layer. The travel rule under the TFR has its own internal control requirements. A CASP must have a policy that defines what information must be collected for outgoing transfers, what happens when a counterparty CASP fails to provide information on incoming transfers, and what the escalation pathway is when travel rule data is inconsistent with other customer information. The CASP cannot simply accept incoming transfers without information and treat the absence as normal. An absence of travel rule data on a transfer is itself a red flag that must be documented and assessed. I want to hear from practitioners on this. What is the single control that your CASP or crypto firm found hardest to operationalize under MiCA? Travel rule data handling, blockchain analytics integration, sanctions screening for on-chain addresses, or something else? Share in the comments. The answer from the industry is often different from what regulators expect. The third line, internal audit, must independently validate that the first and second lines are functioning as designed. For a CASP, this means testing whether transaction monitoring alerts are being reviewed within policy timescales, confirming that compliance has unobstructed access to data and systems, verifying that the risk appetite statement is actually being applied in product decisions, and assessing whether the travel rule controls produce accurate and complete data. The internal audit report must go to the management body, not just the compliance function. If internal audit is reporting to the compliance officer, it is not independent. I have built out a full CASP internal controls framework, mapping the 3 lines model to MiCA Article 62, the ESMA RTS requirements, and the EBA monitoring guidelines, available at davinsidediligence.com. If you are designing or auditing a CASP compliance architecture right now, that resource is built to save you significant time. Full audio is available on the DaVinci Diligence Spotify podcast. When internal controls fail and the NCA finds that failure through an inspection, the consequences under MiCA's sanction regime, Title VII, can include a public reprimand, administrative fines of up to the higher of €5 million or 3% of annual turnover for firms, and personal fines on individuals up to €700,000. In serious cases, temporary prohibition of the senior person responsible from holding management positions and suspension or withdrawal of the CASP authorization. These are not hypothetical numbers, they are written into the regulation. Good practice for a CASP's internal control framework looks like this. The compliance officer presents a quarterly compliance report directly to the board, not filtered through the CEO. The compliance function's budget is a board decision, not a management decision. Internal audit has unrestricted access to all systems and tests the compliance function itself on an annual basis. Transaction monitoring alert closure timelines are tracked as a KPI reported to the board. And the risk appetite statement is reviewed annually by the board with formal sign-off. The core lesson of this episode is straightforward. Under MiCA, compliance is not a cost center to be managed down, it is a licensing condition to be maintained. A compliance function that looks independent on an org chart but is structurally dependent in practice will fail an NCA inspection. The gap between having a compliance officer and having a compliance function is exactly what regulators are trained to find. Subscribe to keep following this series. Episode 5 is where we go deep into customer and product risk, how the EBA risk factor guidelines apply to privacy coins, DeFi interfaces, and non-face-to-face onboarding in the crypto context, and what a CASP must document before delisting a token or refusing a customer. That is a practical episode you do not want to miss.